February 1945. Somewhere behind the crumbling German lines, in a barn that smelled of hay, blood, and carbolic, a young man stared at his own leg like it was already a ghost. Gefreiter Karl Weiss lay on a rough wooden table, shirt cut open, field-gray trousers sliced to the thigh. His right leg was swollen, the skin around the jagged shrapnel wound red and shiny, streaked with angry purple veins climbing toward his groin. The Luftwaffe had vanished from the sky weeks ago. The artillery now thundered from the west instead of the east. They all knew what that meant. The Americans were coming. But right now, the only sound was the rasp of Karl's breathing and the distant clatter of retreating wagons on frozen road. The German battalion doctor stood over him, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. There were no more clean bandages, no more sulfa powder. Just dull instruments, thin spirits, and a single, terrible option. "We have to take it," the doctor said hoarsely, speaking to the orderly, not to Karl. "The infection has already spread. If we do not amputate above the knee, he will be dead by morning." Karl heard every word. His fingers dug into the rough boards. He imagined the rest of his life as a stump, a wooden crutch, the sound of pitying footsteps behind him, or no life at all. Outside, engines roared. Shouted orders. Boots running. A door crashed open, and cold air punched into the barn along with the smell of gasoline and unfamiliar voices. English. American. Medics swept in with white armbands and green jackets. Pistols holstered, hands held high. The German doctor stepped back from the table, scalpel trembling. Within minutes, chaos turned into negotiation. This was no longer a German aid station. It was an American field hospital with German prisoners on the cots. One of the new arrivals pushed through the crowd toward Karl's table. An American captain with dark hair shot through with early gray, stethoscope around his neck instead of a pistol. He glanced at the leg, at the spreading red lines, at the fever glazing Karl's eyes. "Bad one," he muttered. "He's septic. They're right, that leg's a death sentence." He paused. Then, very quietly, almost to himself, "Unless." His hand brushed the pocket of his jacket. Inside, tucked away like contraband, were 4 small glass vials wrapped in cotton. Penicillin. Enough to save maybe 1 or 2 men. Not nearly enough for the dozens screaming and moaning on stretchers all around. The American surgeon looked from the vials to the German soldier on the table. To the enemy. Who would he choose? And what would it mean if the most precious drug in the Allied arsenal went first into the veins of a German? Before that barn, before those vials, war medicine was a quieter kind of massacre. The bullets and shells took their share on the front line. Everyone expected that. But in every war before this one, there was a second killing ground that stretched from the trenches to the hospitals. Infection. In 1914, a soldier might survive a shot to the leg, drag himself to a medic, make it through the crude surgery, and then die days later while his wound oozed yellow and black. The real enemy wasn't always the bullet. It was the invisible tide that invaded after. By 1939, doctors like Captain Daniel Harris, back then just Danny in medical school, had grown up on those stories. Pictures of young men with amputated limbs. Case reports of minor wounds gone catastrophic. Charts showing that more soldiers died from infection than from the initial trauma. They had sulfa drugs now, the miracle powders of the 1930s. Sprinkle them on wounds, mix them into tablets. They helped. Sometimes, but not enough. Danny had watched a farm boy from Iowa die in North Africa from a simple shrapnel wound that turned gangrenous. He'd stood helpless while the boy's leg swelled and split, the smell of sweet rot filling the tent. The fever climbing until delirium turned his words into nonsense. The only tool they'd had left was the saw. Amputation. Take the limb before the infection took the man. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the infection was too fast, or the surgery too late, or the patient too weak. The saw was brutal, but it was familiar, predictable, a ritual that surgeons performed with grim efficiency. Eyes hard to hide the nausea. Then the war threw something new into the mix. A mold scraped from a Petri dish in a London lab. A yellow-brown liquid in small glass vials. A drug that, in early tests, had turned certain death into recovery so dramatic that the charts looked like lies. Penicillin. By the time Danny reached Europe in 1944, the rumors had become reality. He'd seen it work. In a dusty tent outside Cherbourg. They'd given it to a GI with a massive abdominal wound. The man had been gray, drifting, his pulse thready. The surgeons had cut, drained, prayed. In the old days, he would have been a teaching case. A nothing more we can do statistic. They'd injected penicillin every 3 hours. Watched the fever break. Watched the blood pressure stabilize. Watched, with something like fear, as a man who should have been dead sat up and asked for coffee. It felt like cheating death itself. But there was a catch. There was never enough. Penicillin was still new, still difficult to mass produce, still shipped in tiny quantities that vanished within days in every frontline hospital. There were priority lists. Wounded officers. Promising cases. Clean Americans first. Allies next. Enemy soldiers? They were supposed to be last. Officially, anyway. Unofficially, morality and necessity kept colliding in every tent and barn. Because when you looked into the eyes of a wounded man, the uniform around him had a way of fading. You just saw another human drifting toward the edge, and if you had something in your pocket that could pull him back, you had to decide what kind of doctor you really were. That was the quiet war inside the big one, the one Danny Harris was fighting as he stood over a German soldier in a stolen barn. 4 vials of penicillin in his pocket, and a decision that would ripple far beyond one boy's leg. Captain Daniel Harris had been awake for 20 hours. When they rolled Karl Weiss into his world, the barn was their 3rd hospital in 2 weeks. The front moved. They followed. The last place had been a schoolhouse, before that a half-blown-out church. Now, under rafters that still smelled faintly of cows and straw, they stacked cots between stalls and hung lamps from hooks where harnesses once swung. You're on the German side of the road now, the colonel had told him that morning, pointing at the map with a nicotine-stained finger. Prisoners will be coming in alongside our boys. Treat what you can. Tag what you can't. We move again in 48 hours. The same speech he'd heard in Sicily and Normandy on the drive to the Rhine. He'd nodded, thinking about supplies. Thinking about blood. Thinking about the small white box of something that wasn't on any official list. Penicillin. He'd received the package 2 days earlier. A supply officer he'd gone to school with had slipped it to him with a quick, guilty smile. Don't ask where it came from, the man had said. Use it on the ones you can actually bring back. And be ready to justify every drop. So Danny had tucked the vials into his personal kit. It was easier to carry the weight on his belt than the weight in his conscience. By dusk, the wounded began to pour in. They came in jeeps, in wagons, on doors repurposed as stretchers. American infantry with blast wounds, British tankers burned in turret fires, a French civilian with half his face gone from flying glass. And Germans. Gray coats stripped, helmets gone, field dressing stained through. Some defiant, some pleading, most just. Stunned. War had a way of reducing everyone to the same grim features. By the time they carried Karl in, Danny's gloves were already slick with other people's blood. An orderly pulled back the blanket from the German's leg. The room seemed to tilt for a second. The wound was a mess. A slice of metal the size of a finger had torn into the calf, then ripped upward, shredding muscle. The initial German bandage was soaked through. the edges greenish. Red streaks radiated from the wound like cracks in ice. Crawling up toward the groin, Karl's face was waxy, his blond hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His eyes blinked slowly, unfocused. "Temp?" Danny barked. 40 degrees, the nurse replied, breathless. "Pulse 140 and weak. Septic? Name?" he asked out of habit. The interpreter stepped in. "Gefreiter Karl Weiss," she said. 20 years old. 352nd Infantry Division. Wounded 3 days ago. Evacuated yesterday when their line broke. The German battalion doctor hovered nearby. Still in his dirty tunic, hands stained, eyes hollow. "I told him," the man said in accented English, voice rough. "We must take the leg. I have no ether, no proper antiseptic. But the infection, you see?" He gestured helplessly. Danny saw. This was textbook. Straight out of the lectures he'd half slept through. Spreading cellulitis, lymphangitis, systemic involvement. The standard of care for 100 years. Amputate as high as necessary, as fast as possible. "We're not taking anything yet," he said curtly. The German doctor frowned. "If you delay, you kill him." "Maybe," Danny replied. "Or maybe I save both his leg and his life." The older man's eyes narrowed, skeptical. "With what? Prayers?" With what indeed? For a moment, the barn receded. The moans, the clatter of instruments, the shouted orders, all of it became a dull roar in the background. In the front of Danny's mind. Only 2 images remained. The Iowa farm boy turning gray as infection ate him alive, and the GI outside Cherbourg, sitting up 3 days after penicillin had seemed to pull him out of the grave. His hand drifted to his pocket. Feeling the outline of glass. He thought of the memo from HQ. Penicillin supplies remain limited. Priority to allied personnel in cases with high probability of recovery and strategic value. He thought of the line another surgeon had growled over coffee. "If we start giving that stuff to prisoners, we'll never get enough to keep our own boys alive." He also thought of the oath he'd taken. Back when war had been a hypothetical and he still believed most problems could be fixed with the right diagnosis. First, do no harm. But what counted as harm? Cutting off a leg he might not need to cut, or withholding the one thing that might make cutting unnecessary? He looked at Karl's face, the boy, because that's how he looked now. Just a boy, was staring at the ceiling, lips moving soundlessly. His hands were shaking. "Does he understand what's happening?" Danny asked the interpreter. She listened to the murmured German, then nodded. He thinks this is the end. He keeps saying he doesn't want to go home without a leg. That his father will not recognize him." Danny swallowed. The room snapped back into focus. He made his decision. "Get me a line in his arm," he told the nurse. "We're starting penicillin. Full dose. Every 3 hours. Prep the leg for debridement, not amputation. I want that wound opened, cleaned, and drained. We're going to give the drug a chance to work before we start sawing." The German doctor stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You risk a precious medicine on the enemy?" he demanded. "On a case that is already lost?" Danny met his eyes. "On a 20-year-old kid with a life ahead of him," he said. "And on a leg I'm not ready to bury yet." He turned away, not giving himself room to hesitate, because if he did, he knew the voices in his head cue other surgeons. The cold logic of triage would start arguing again. Instead, he focused on the routine he knew: incision, irrigation, debridement. Behind him, a nurse drew penicillin into a syringe. The pale liquid shimmering under the lamplight like something out of science fiction. It was a gamble. If it failed, the boy might die. If it worked, it would prove something that went far beyond one soldier, one leg. One barn. It would prove that even in the middle of the ugliest war humanity had ever seen, a mold from a petri dish could change the rules and force men like Danny to decide whether their loyalties were to flags or to life itself. The first injection went in just before midnight. Karl barely flinched. His fever was high enough that the world seemed hazy, edges softened, sounds coming from far away. He felt the sting in his arm, the cold rush up the vein, then nothing but the familiar pounding in his skull. For Danny, every second of the next few hours felt sharp. He had done the mechanical work. They'd cleaned the wound, cut away dead tissue, left the leg open to drain. The smell had been awful, the kind that stuck in your sinuses and turned even seasoned stomachs. God. Russo, the orderly, had muttered, pressing a cloth to his nose. Every time we do one of these, I swear I'll never eat stew again. Now gauze packed the cavity. Tubes allowed pus and fluid to escape. A crude but effective drain. In the old days, it would have been a stopgap before the inevitable chop. Tonight, it was a test. At 3 a.m., they gave the second dose of penicillin. Temperature? Danny asked. Still 40, the nurse replied. Pulse 138. Too high. Too fast. He moved to the next bed, and the next after that, sewing, splinting, listening to lungs, reading pulses. But his eyes kept flicking back to the German in the corner. Every time he passed, the German doctor was there too, watching. You will kill him with your waiting, the man said once, unable to keep quiet any longer. The infection does not respect hope. Neither does the saw, Danny shot back. Exhausted enough that the words came out harsher than he intended. At dawn, the colonel came through. Coat buttoned high against the cold draft slipping through the planks. How's our miracle drug holding up? He asked, scanning the rows. Danny hesitated. Too early to tell, sir. The colonel's eyes landed on Karl, on the gray pallor. On the damp hair? That one? He asked. Yes, sir. The colonel's expression chilled slightly. That one is wearing the wrong uniform, Harris. I noticed, Danny replied. You want to explain to me why some of the vials I signed for yesterday are already empty? The colonel asked quietly. Because you can't unsee how it works, Danny thought. Because once you've watched penicillin turn death around, it becomes impossible to draw neat lines about who deserves it. Aloud, he said, because we're here to practice medicine, sir, not vengeance. The colonel studied him for a long moment. Triage exists for a reason, he said finally. We don't have the luxury of treating everyone like this as a Boston hospital. Use your judgment. But remember who's paying for that judgment. He walked on. Danny exhaled. He checked the charts. Did the math in his head? How many vials remained? How many cases might be saved? How many he was willing to risk on a single leg. By noon, Karl's fever spiked. 40-1 degrees. He started muttering in German, eyes glassy, body shivering despite the heat. The interpreter leaned in. He's asking for his brother, she said softly. He thinks he's back on a farm. He doesn't understand where he is. Red streaks still climbed the leg. The skin around the wound looked angrier, not less. His blood pressure dipped. Septic shock, the nurse murmured. He's crashing. Russo gave Danny a look that said what he didn't dare say aloud. It's not working. Danny's stomach twisted. He'd known this might happen. The textbooks were clear. Penicillin wasn't magic. Timing mattered. Dosage mattered. Some infections laughed at anything you threw at them, but knowing and seeing were different beasts. The German doctor approached again, face tight. Now you must cut, he said. If you want any chance. Danny stared at the leg. He could. He had the saw, the anesthesia, the training. One more amputation in a war that had already taken so many limbs no one bothered to count them anymore. If he cut now and the boy survived, everyone would nod. You did what you had to. If he waited and the boy died, some would say, you wasted penicillin on a German. But something in the timing bothered him. The leg looked worse. But the numbers? He checked the chart again. The pulse had dropped slightly. The nurse had noted a brief drop in temperature after the last dose. Before the spike, the infection might be fighting back, but so was the drug. He thought of the first GI he'd saved with penicillin. How the man had looked worse before he looked better. As the bacteria died inside him and his body flared with reaction. It's not done yet, Danny said quietly. You gamble with his life because you have something new in a bottle? The German doctor snapped. I have seen men die while colleagues chase novelty. Danny's jaw clenched. I gamble with his life because I have seen the alternative, he replied. And I am not ready to throw away that leg. He turned to the nurse. We keep the doses going. Every 3 hours. I want fluids pushed. Watch his blood pressure. If it drops below this line, he tapped the chart, you call me. Wherever I am. The German doctor shook his head and walked away. Muttering, the day dragged. Outside, artillery thumped. A constant reminder that the world didn't pause for any one patient's crisis. Trucks came and went. More wounded. More decisions. Inside, the barn felt like the center of a very small, very intense universe. The 3rd, 4th, 5th doses went in. By evening, the fever seemed to level. Not down, but not climbing higher. 39.8, the nurse reported. Pulse 120. Still weak, but not worse, Danny finished. He walked to the foot of the bed, lifted the sheet. The red streaks along the leg seemed to have stopped their climb. They hadn't receded. But they also hadn't advanced. The line between life and death had become, literally, a line on a man's skin. The night promised no answers, only more. Waiting, more injections in the dark, more quiet arguments in the back of Danny's mind, because the real test of penicillin wasn't just whether it could kill bacteria. It was whether the men who controlled it could. Let it change the way they made choices, and as dawn crept back in, pale through the barn's dirt-streaked windows, the outcome of that gamble began to show itself in subtle ways. The crisis hit just before dawn on the 2nd day. The barn was at its quietest then. The moans softened into whimpers. The clatter of instruments paused. Even the distant rumble of guns seemed to hush, as if the front itself were catching its breath. Danny had stolen an hour of sleep in a chair, chin tucked to his chest, when a hand shook his shoulder. Captain, the nurse whispered. It's Weiss. Something's wrong. The adrenaline hit before the words fully registered. He was on his feet, moving between cots, his body remembering the path even if his mind still shook off dreams. Karl lay where he had before. But the change was immediate. His skin, once flushed and hot, was now pale and clammy. Sweat pasted his hair to his forehead. His breathing was quick, shallow. The sheet rose and fell in tiny, rapid jerks. Blood pressure? Danny snapped. 60/40, the nurse replied, voice tight. Pulse 150, thready. Shock. For a moment, the old familiar instinct roared in. He's gone septic. The infection's too far. You gambled and you lost. Cut your losses literally and take the leg before his organs shut down. But another part of him, the part that had spent the last 2 years watching patterns, noticed something else. Temperature? He asked. 38.2, she said. It dropped a full degree in the last hour. A drop dot in a septic patient. A falling fever with collapsing blood. Pressure could mean two things. Either the infection had overwhelmed the body so completely that it no longer had the strength to mount a fever, or the bacteria were dying in such large numbers that their remnants were triggering a massive inflammatory response, a Jerish Herxheimer-like reaction. He'd seen it in a textbook once, a footnote in an article about penicillin and bacterial toxins. Theory. Back then. Now, maybe it was happening in front of him. He didn't have the luxury of certainty. He had minutes. Get fluids wide open, he ordered. Normal saline. Hang 2 bags. The nurse moved fast, adjusting drip rates, checking lines. The German doctor appeared at the edge of the circle as if summoned by the smell of crisis. His eyes swept the vitals, the leg, the cold sweat. Now? He asked. Or do you still want to wait for your wonder drug to save him? Danny walked to the end of the bed, peeled back the blanket. The wound looked no better. Angry, swollen. The red streaks remained, but something in their color had changed. Less bright. The edges blurred. He pressed gently along the thigh. It was still hot, but not burning. He placed a hand on the young man's chest, feeling the rabbit-fast heartbeat. In the dim light, Karl's eyes fluttered open. For the first time since they'd pulled him in, he seemed, they're not trapped in fevered dreams, not babbling to invisible brothers. His gaze fixed on Danny's face. Confusion flickered. Then fear. Then a quiet, exhausted curiosity. In halting English, wrapped in a thick German accent, he whispered, Am I dead? The question hit Danny harder than any shouted accusation. No, he said, more firmly than he felt. Not yet. Behind him, the German doctor's impatience hardened into anger. This is madness, he said. You cling to a theory while a man bleeds out his life. If you cut now, you can still save him. If you wait? If I cut now, Danny interrupted, I'd take his leg and maybe his life anyway. He heard the edge in his own voice. Knew this wasn't just about one patient anymore. It was about everything this war had taught him, and everything this drug was forcing him to unlearn. He turned to Hilda, the nurse. Keep the fluids going. Start a blood transfusion if his pressure drops any further. Keep the penicillin schedule. Next dose in 40 minutes. You're doubling down, the German doctor said, incredulous. On an experiment. Danny met his gaze. On a choice, he said. If I'm wrong, you get to say, I told you so at my court-martial. He walked away before the man could respond. Not out of disrespect, but because he had other fires to put out. 2 cots down. An American sergeant was coughing up pink froth. Pulmonary edema. He needed morphine and oxygen. A British private's abdominal wound was leaking through his dressing. They took him back to the makeshift operating table. The barn became a whirlwind. Again. Clamp, suture, swab, check. Throughout it all, the clock on the wall marched relentlessly toward the next. Penicillin dose. 30 minutes. 2010. Each time Danny glanced at Karl, he saw small shifts. The blood pressure hovered. Not rising, but not dropping further either. The pulse, still fast, lost a bit of its wild edge. The breathing, though quick, sounded less frantic. 8 milliliters left, the nurse said, holding up the last vial. This is it for today. Danny nodded. Give it. She slid the needle into the vein, pushed the plunger steadily. The clear liquid disappeared into the tubing, into the arm, into the unseen battle raging at microscopic scale. Outside, an artillery barrage rolled closer, shaking dust from the barn beams. Somewhere a shell landed too near, rattling instruments on their trays. For a moment, everyone looked up, instincts still wired for incoming fire. Then, as if the war itself had decided to finally pass them by, the thunder rolled away again. Hours blurred. At some point mid-morning, Danny realized the background noise in the barn had changed. The cries had softened. The pacing of boots had slowed. Someone had started a low murmur of a song at the far end. A nurse humming under her breath as she changed dressings. He checked the chart again. Temperature, he asked. 37.8, the nurse replied. Pulse 110. Blood pressure, 80/50. No, wait, 90/60. He stepped to the bedside. Karl's skin was no longer clammy, just damp. His cheeks held a faint hint of color. His eyes, when they opened, were clearer. Wasser. Please, he croaked. The interpreter translated before Danny could. They gave him a few sips. Careful not to overwhelm his stomach. His legs still looked terrible, swollen, angry, but the red streaks had retreated. Only by a few centimeters, but they had moved. The line of infection was pulling back. The German doctor stared, jaw set, refusing to speak, but his eyes couldn't hide what he saw. His body responds, he muttered, almost to himself. His body responds because we finally gave it a fighting chance, Danny said quietly. The barn door banged open. The colonel strode in, wind snapping at his coat. News from division, he announced. We're pushing forward again tomorrow. Pack what you can't leave. We roll out at dawn. He stopped, noticing the cluster around Karl's bed. How's your controversial project? He asked. Donnie stepped aside so he could see. Weiss, Karl, he said, as if presenting a case at ward rounds. Severe septic wound. 2 days of penicillin. No amputation. Alive, stable, improving. He could have given the professional answer. Because I'm a doctor, because it was a valuable case, because the war will be over soon and these things will matter. He didn't say any of those. Instead, he said, because I've seen too many men lose things they didn't have to lose. The interpreter translated. Karl frowned, thinking, then nodded slowly. I thought, amputation is normal, he murmured. For us. For you. For everyone. It used to be, Danny admitted. Not anymore. Not if we can help it. Word of the case spread beyond the barn. Other doctors came by to look. A British captain, his sleeves rolled up, whistled softly at the sight of the healing wound. Good God, he said. We'd have taken that leg off in the first hour. If this stuff does what it seems to, the textbooks will need a rewrite. The German doctor finally spoke more than a sentence. He watched as Danny carefully unwrapped the bandage, revealing pink granulation tissue where rotted flesh had been. The smell was of antiseptic and blood, not decay. Your drug, he said slowly, in careful English. It will change everything. It already is, Danny replied. Every hospital, every operating room, every battlefield. We're just catching up to it. The German nodded, then looked at Karl. In the last war, he said, when I was young like you, we would have taken your leg, filled in the forms, and shrugged. That is war. He shook his head. This war is lost, he continued quietly. But you have something the last generation did not. Not just defeat. A future where men do not have to fear every scratch. For the Allies, penicillin meant something slightly different. It meant wounded soldiers returning to duty faster. Fewer amputees straining post-war budgets. Fewer funerals. It was efficiency, as well as mercy. But in that barn, on that cot, it meant something as simple and profound as a man keeping the ability to stand as the days passed. Karl progressed from bed rest to dangling his legs over the side. The first time his feet touched straw, he nearly cried from the shock of sensation. Slow, Danny cautioned, standing ready with a hand on his shoulder. One thing at a time. The first time he tried to stand, the wounded leg buckled and he fell back, breath hissing through his teeth. Again, he insisted. They worked like that for days. 2 steps, 3, a shuffle from cot to doorway. Eventually, a careful hobble outside. Under the pale winter sun, he walked past American cots and German cots, Allied bandages and enemy bandages. Men who might have killed each other a week earlier now shared cigarettes and stories. Boredom-eroding old hatreds. An American GI with his arm in a sling nodded at Karl as he shuffled by. "Nice work, Fritz," he said, voice half teasing, half genuine. "That's more than some of us can manage." Karl didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He nodded back. One morning, orders came down. The front was moving again. The barn hospital would be consolidated into a larger facility closer to the rear. Wounded would be sorted Allied toward one set of trains. Germans toward another. Repatriation. Even the word felt unreal. The interpreter approached. Karl's cot with a stack of papers. "You are being transferred," she explained. "First to a POW hospital. Then, maybe, home. When the war ends." Home. The idea felt foreign. His village. His parents' farm. A younger brother who might not recognize him in this thin, haunted man. He looked at his leg. Not pretty. Not strong yet, but his. He turned to Danny. "I will." "Walk," he said in halting English, pointing down, then out. "To my Heimat, my home." "I believe it," Danny replied. They shook hands. It was an awkward grip, calloused palm to calloused palm. The uncomfortable press of two men who had been raised to see each other as monsters. But it was also something else. An acknowledgement that what had happened in that barn had not just been a medical victory. It had been a small, quiet armistice. Between old ways of accepting loss and new ways of insisting on saving what could be saved. Outside, trucks revved. Stretchers lifted. The war rolled on, but for Karl Weiss and Daniel Harris, the trajectory of their lives had bent around a few glass vials and a decision that might easily have gone the other way. In the years to come, penicillin would become routine. Antibiotics would expand, multiply, sometimes be abused. Surgeons would think nothing of saving limbs that their grandfathers would have sawed off by reflex. The miracle would become standard. But neither of them would ever quite forget that. Once in a freezing barn with a dirt floor, it had not been standard at all. It had been a choice, made in the space, between fear and courage, between we've always done it this way and we don't have to anymore. Years after the guns went silent, in a small Bavarian town, an older man with a faint limp would sometimes stop and look at his reflection in a shop window. He would see a grocer, or a clerk, or a father, whatever life had made of him, standing on two legs. One of them ached in winter. The scar still pulled when the weather changed. But it was there. He would adjust his trouser cuff, smile wryly at his own vanity, and walk on. At almost the same hour, on another continent, a retired American surgeon might wash his hands at a sink that no longer smelled of blood and carbolic. He'd see his own reflection, lines carved by years of choices, and sometimes, in the corner of his mind, a barn would flicker into view. A feverish young man. A knife that never touched bone. A syringe pushing pale liquid into a shaking arm. War is often remembered for the ways it destroys. But sometimes, quietly, it is also the stage on which humanity learns how to save better. If there's one thing to carry from this story, it's this. The real revolution in that winter barn wasn't the drug in the vial. It was the decision to use it on someone who wore the wrong uniform. In that simple act, surgery stepped out of the 19th century, and medicine remembered that its first loyalty is not to flags, but to life. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human even in the darkest of times.